we're halfway done with this chapter, but we're going to continue on with the integration of somatic functions. So with this one, we're going to talk about how sensory systems can integrate themselves with the central nervous system. We'll talk about some of the two major ascending pathways in the spinal cord. We'll talk about the pathway of somatosensory input for the face and compare that to the ascending pathways we find in the spinal cord. And then we'll talk about the topographical representation of sensory information. So when we're looking at sensory nerves, right, these are, depending on whether we're looking at spinal or cranial, we're going to have some differences in how they kind of work, I guess you could say, or how they wire up with the central nervous system. So spinal nerves have afferent axons. Afferent, we think, we're arriving, so these are going to connect the sensory receptors to the central nervous system, right? And then efferent axons that are traveling to the muscles, and so spinal nerves are going to have both, right? They're going to have the afferent axons that are going from receptor to central nervous system, and efferent axons that are going from central nervous system to effectors like muscles, organs, things like that. So they're mixed, right? They're mixed. And when we look at these spinal nerves and how they connect to the brain, right, they're contralateral, right? So spinal nerves, when they finally get all the way up to the brain, remember they're connecting to the spinal cord and then traveling up. These are contralateral, meaning the right side is going to be connected to the left side of the brain. The left side of the body is connected to the right side of the brain. So everything's flip-flopped. And this is probably what you've heard before, like, oh yeah, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. And for the spinal nerves, that much is true. But with the cranial nerves, these are the ones, remember, that connect directly to the brain. These are ipsilateral, meaning they stay on the same side. So the cranial nerve that connects on the right is connected to the right side of the brain. There's a small exception in that the optic and the facial nerves are neither. They're not ipsilateral and they're not contralateral. I want to point out that they're not either, right? And that they're, or at least with the optic nerve, it's not either, because if we look here, we actually see that it crosses over to both sides. So like the optic nerve is a bit of a weirdo in this case because we have one tract, right, that is going and staying on the same side, like this left eye is rooting and wiring to the occipital lobe on the right, but we also have part of it that is wiring over to the left. So it's not ipsilateral, it's both, right? It's going to connect to both sides. So let's go ahead and now get into our ascending pathways. So this is like a sensory pathway that's taking peripheral sensations, right? So sensations from like your hand, your arm, your leg, right? Things like that. They're going to, that pathway is referred to as an ascending pathway or an ascending tract, right? It's because we're taking that signal from some other body part and we're moving it up towards the brain. If the stimuli, right, if the information we're getting is coming from below the neck, we're going to pass along the sensory pathways in the spinal cord. But if the stimulus comes from the head and the neck, that's going to travel right through the cranial nerves. Usually we're talking about the trigeminal system. So anything below the neck, we're going to involve the spinal cord. If we're looking at the head and the neck, we're just we're bypassing that. We're going straight to the brain. And we have two systems, two pathways that are going to bring this sensory information to the brain. The dorsal column system and the spinothalamic tract. I'm going to use the terms that are in bold. So the dorsal column system, that's sometimes called the dorsal column medial lemniscus. I'm not going to use that. I'll just use dorsal column system for you guys if I use it at all. Right, but those are the two major pathways. So let's look at the dorsal column system first. So this is responsible for touch sensation and proprioception. So again, awareness of like how you're oriented, movement, things like that, below the neck, right? So any sort of touch, any sort of like awareness of your orientation from below the neck. This is going to start with the axon from the dorsal root ganglion, right? So one of those dorsal root ganglion neurons is going to enter the dorsal root and join the dorsal column white matter in the spinal cord. We can then split that dorsal column into two component tracts. The fasciculus gracilis, this is going to be involved with the lower body, right? So lower part of the trunk and down, including the legs. And the fasciculus cuneatus, that's going to be involved with the upper body and the arms, right? So we kind of have it split, like split the body in half, right? Fasciculus gracilis handling the lower part of the body, right? Fasciculus cuneatus handling the upper part of the body, right? These tracts are going to stop at their respective nuclei in the medulla, right? In the medulla of the brain. And once we get to the decussation in the medulla, we're going to continue these axons on as the medial lemniscus, which is why you see that as part of the name sometimes, and it'll stop in the thalamus. Right. The very last neuron projects its axons to the postcentral gyrus in the cerebral cortex. The spinothalamic tract, though, this is going to deal with pain and temperature sensation below the neck, so a little bit different, right, in terms of what we're handling. The spinothalamic tract is going to start with neurons from a dorsal root ganglion. We then extend those to the dorsal horn, and then they'll synapse with another neuron in their pathway. The axons from there then are going to decussate within the spinal cord, go up to the brain, enter the thalamus. There's a third neuron in that pathway for them to synapse with. In the thalamus, the neurons then project their axons into the spinothalamic tract, which then goes to the post-central gyrus of the cerebral cortex. So this is looking at the two systems. We have the dorsal column system on the left, we have the spinothalamic tract on the right. And so we see some similarities in how things are carried up. So we have our dorsal root ganglion. So again, this is touch, proprioception. In this case, we're looking at it from the right side of the body, right? This is going to pass up, in this case, through the nucleus cuneatus, right? Let's say this is coming from the arm, right? Because that's what would handle it if it was like from the arm. If it was like the leg, it'd be traveling through the nucleus gracilis, which is in this lighter kind of lime green you see in here, right? Traveling up, we get to the nucleus of that part of the pathway, right? And then we're going to pass over, right, at the medial lemniscus, we're going to pass over to the left in this case. So we started on the right, entering up through the dorsal root ganglion. In this case, being handled by the fasciculus cuneatus. Travel up. When we get to the nucleus cuneatus, we're going to then move over into the medial lemniscus, pass over to the left, travel up through that medial lemniscus all the way up till we get to the thalamus, and then to that post-central gyrus in the cerebrum. And each of these colors is representing a neuron. So we have our first neuron here, our second neuron here, and then purple shows our last one. So these guys are long, right? These are super long. On the spinothalamic tract, we have, again, pain and temperature sensations from the right side of the body. Coming in, we are going to use the gray matter in the spinal cord to immediately shift over from the right to the left to move up the lateral spinothalamic tract. We go up to the thalamus and then to the post-central gyrus. And again, each of these colors represents a neuron. So we have our first, our second, and our third. Right? If you can sum up what's happening in these pictures, I'm generally happy. So I know like the previous slide, there's a lot of writing. It's a lot, kind of a little crazy. But if you can look at these pictures and have an understanding of what's going on, I'll generally be happy. Especially if you know what each piece is, or at least know the general pathway of how this sensation or how this information would be passed to the brain. Now let's look at the trigeminal pathway. So this is looking at the information coming from the face, head, mouth, nasal cavity, right? Like just the head, right? And in the face, and all the parts that go along with the face. And so this is going to be one of our cranial nerves. So let's go ahead and get into how we follow this pathway. So the axons from the trigeminal ganglion, they're going to go right into the brainstem at the level of the pons. And so if you go back and look at the picture where you see like that map of all of the cranial nerves, you'll notice that the trigeminal nerve connects at the pons. So we're going to connect there, and then the axons are going to go one of three ways. They're going to go to the spinal trigeminal nucleus in the medulla, the chief sensory nucleus in the pons, or the mesencephalic nuclei in the midbrain. So we're going to split, right? So trigeminal, right? Three, hey. We're going to split into three, one going to the pons, one going to the medulla, one going to the midbrain. So we're kind of splitting between the three major parts of the brainstem. The axons from the second neuron are going to decussate and go up to the thalamus, right, along the trigeminothalamic tract. So the name alone there kind of gives you information. We're connecting the trigeminal and the thalamus. And then from there, again, another third neuron in the pathway, that's going to send us to the primary somatosensory cortex. You'll notice that the thalamus is coming in and kind of helping us branch into the right area. So you can kind of think of the thalamus like a gateway. It's like kind of deciding who goes where depending on where the signal's coming from, what kind of signal it is. And I almost forgot, when saying decussate, all we mean is crossing over, right? That's all we're talking about when we say that. So crossing to form like an X shape, right, is what we're looking at there. Now, in terms of other pathways, right, because we have, I mean, think about your sense of taste, your sense of hearing, your sense of balance, your sense of vision. How are all of these passing up, and how is their pathway looking? So with gustation, we have the facial and the glossopharyngeal nerves. They're going to synapse into the solitary nucleus in the brainstem, and then project to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. And remember, gustation is handled by that inner lobe, which is the insula. When it comes to audition, which again is hearing, right, the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to synapse into the cochlear nuclei. We find this in the superior part of the medulla, right? This is where information from both ears compared, and this is going to help us determine location of the sound. So depending on which ear, what information we're getting from each ear is going to get a little bit of different information because they're on each side of your head. And so we can tell where a sound is coming from because we're bringing that information together from both ears and kind of comparing it, like, oh, on this side it's quieter, on this side it's different, that must mean it's the side that sound is not coming from. On this side it's louder, it's more directed, more clear and more directed, hey, that's going to be the side the sound is coming from. So vestibulocochlear nerve into the cochlear nuclei in the superior medulla, then into the inferior colliculus, this is in the midbrain, and then the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus and superior colliculus. With balance, the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to handle this as well, because remember, the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to be connecting the vestibule and semicircular canals and whatnot, as well as the cochlea. With balance, we're going to synapse with the vestibular nuclei in the medulla or the cerebellum. Because remember, the cerebellum is really the one that's kind of really taking all these movements, taking how we're moving, what our location is, what our orientation is, and then putting it all together so that we can have a stable posture, right, or in stable movement. And then vision, your optic tract, so we're going from the optic nerve to the optic tract, is going to synapse onto the lateral geniculate nucleus we find in the thalamus, the superior colliculus, and then the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Moving on to the diencephalon, so this is where we're going to talk more about that thalamus, because it's one of the two major components of the diencephalon. Again, it's a relay between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system. I told you it's kind of like a gateway, right, where information comes in and then it's directed where to go in the rest of the brain, in the cerebrum. And so a lot of the information you get from your special senses, with the exception of scent, that's going to be coming up through the thalamus, through all of those ascending tracts. So let's take a deeper look at the thalamus quickly. So there's three major regions to the thalamus, right? We have the anterior nucleus, the medial nuclei, and the lateral nuclei. The anterior nucleus is going to be a relay between the hypothalamus and the limbic system, which is involved with memory and emotion. The medial nuclei is going to serve as a relay between the limbic system and the basal ganglia of the cerebral cortex. And then your special and your somatic senses connect through the lateral nuclei, and that's where they get relayed to the appropriate sensory cortex in the cerebrum. So making sure they get sent to the right area for, like, if we need, to send that information to primary motor control or whatever, we can send it to the right part of the cerebrum. And then the hypothalamus, this is going to be involved in both somatic and autonomic functions. We'll talk a little bit more about autonomic functions in the next chapter. And it also is going to communicate with the limbic system, which again is involved in emotion and memory. So when it comes to the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex has what's called a sensory topography. And so what we're talking about here is just like a mapping system, right? And that mapping system is kept the same. We've seen some of these maps before, like when we saw the primary motor area and the somatosensory areas, using the homunculus, right? The little weird looking guy with the body parts kind of coming out of the brain in that little section. And that's just showing which parts of the body are wired where in the brain. And so we're going to look at one of those with the retina in the visual cortex and how that's maintained in the visual pathway. With the visual pathway, things are upside down and left is right, though. And the reason being is that when light coming from the superior visual field falls on the inferior retina, and then the light from the inferior visual field falls on the superior retina, right? And so then that topography is maintained so that the superior region of the visual cortex processes the inferior visual field and vice versa, because they get flipped on the retina. And so the visual field information is inverted, right? It's upside down and backwards when it enters the visual cortex. So up is down and left is right. So that might sound a little weird, just saying it out loud, but if we look at a picture, so this is the mapping that we see. And so if we're looking at the visual field, right, here's the left side, here's the right side, right, and then the upper and the lower field. So when we're looking at this, right, the way it hits the eye, the way it hits the retina, is it hits it this way, right, upside down. And then because of the wiring, right, because of the wiring here in like this part of the house here, right, so we're getting like, here's what we can see, right, with the left eye. So we have stuff that's on the very left and stuff that's kind of in the center right, right, but because of the way it hits, the house here hits over on this side, so it gets carried over to the right. The right side of this eye's vision is going to hit the left side, so it's going to be processed by the left. So this is what the image actually is. This is what each eye picks up. And then because of the wiring, right, we cross over a little bit, and so the integrated image we get, right, is actually flipped right and left, and it's still upside down. We correct for that, obviously, after the fact, but this is the raw image that is received by that by the visual cortex.